I want to talk a little bit about American politics and why they're so stagnant. And I did a segment called Why the Senate is the Least Deliberative Body, or Why It's Not the Most Deliberative Body, something along those lines. And I essentially outlined a good portion of what I'm about to say. So I'm gonna skip it. If you need the context from that video, please close out this video and watch that video first. So the way that American politics is set up, originally there were no political parties, right? So when you go way, way back, there weren't political parties originally, not the way that we understand them now. They were groups of individuals who were vying for political power, and oftentimes those people already had some political power, right? So if you think about like the founding fathers and the people who were attached to them, and all the characters in Hamilton, in the Hamilton musical, which you should go see, it's quite good. Those individuals already had some level of political, I don't want to say power, gravitas is probably the word I'm looking for, just kind of that feeling of power about them, that feeling of leadership about them, because they had kind of facilitated the removal of the 13 colonies from the British Empire. And originally, it was just them and some other folks who came from either wealthy backgrounds or who were very educated, trying to gain their way up the system. So why did parties develop? So there is a French political scientist, I believe his name was Henry Duverger. I know his last name is Duverger, I just think his first name is Henry, or Henri, as it would be in French. But he posited a very specific rule, that a very specific rule exists in political systems. And he said, it's called Duverger's law, by the way. If you have a majority win type of voting system, as in you have to get 51% of the vote to win, two parties will emerge, and not more than two parties. There will always only be two choices, right? So the American system, as it was set up way back in the day and continues to this day, is that in order to win office, you have to have a majority of the votes. You can't win by a plurality, things like that. And by the way, this was before the invention of things like ranked choice voting and other types of systems that kind of manipulated what's called first past the post or majoritarian voting systems to change them up and to make them more open. But originally, you have the majoritarian voting systems. And essentially, what he posited, and it has essentially been true for every country ever, is that if you have a voting system that is based off of majority percent to win, majoritarian victory, only two parties will emerge. Only two main parties will exist. And this is true. This is true in the United States, but it's also true in other countries that have similar systems. Most countries do not have systems like that. Oh, additionally, we have a presidential system as opposed to a parliamentary system. So what a presidential system does is a presidential system has an elected president in power. And by the way, he or she or they have to be elected by a majority. Again, you get that majoritarian electoral system, two parties develop. And alas, in countries with elected presidents that do not have parliamentary systems, typically, that do not also have prime ministers, typically two parties have emerged. So the US is the prime example here. Now, in a slightly comparative example, if you look at France, who has an elected president, but there are multiple parties. So how can this be, you ask? Because the president has to receive a majority to win. One, the French presidential election has runoffs. So there are candidates eliminated after the first round of voting, depending on what they get. And then fewer parties vie for the spotlight, and eventually two parties end up going against each other. So that allows it. But also, France has a parliamentary system where multiple parties vie for groups of seats. The government is then formed when groups of parties come together to form a majority, which forms the government. Okay. So that's why the French example is slightly different, even though they have an elected president, just like we have an elected president. but it works a little bit differently because of the way their system is structured. In the United States, every district, every voting district only has one person that comes out of it. So that's called a district magnitude of 1, okay? And again, they're elected by majority rule. So again, only 2 parties really can compete for them. Now, there are some places where quote-unquote third parties have sprung up to contest these seats because one of the 2 major U.S. parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, isn't as viable. So in a city like Philadelphia or in a city like New York City, where there are lots of Democrats, right, you might get the Greens or a Socialist Party or the Working Families Party able to get candidates in for those districts because the Republican Party, which would ordinarily serve as the loser in the majoritarian system in those particular cities, is not particularly active because they know they can't win, right? So it boils down between the competition between a different 2 sets of parties, which would be in this case the Greens and the Dems, or the Socialists and the Dems, or whatever, the Socialists and the Greens, or whatever it's going to be, right? Essentially, what happens is it always comes down to 2 parties. So, Ben, what does this have to do with the stagnation of U.S. politics? Well, I'll tell you. So, in presidential systems, there is what happens is negotiation for who gets into government essentially happens before the election happens, right? So the parties have lots of power to decide who gets to go up on the ballot, right? This coalition building, as it's called, happens before people get into office. Because once they're in office, you have a good idea of who wins and who loses, right? Who controls the House right now? The Democrats. Who controls the Senate right now? It kind of depends on, what day of the week it is. But it is split 50-50, right? Who controls the presidency? The Democrats, right? It's zero sum. No one else can have it. There is one winner and one loser, which again perpetuates this 2-party system. So because the coalition building is done ahead of time and the party elites, and I mean that in the sense of like people who have power within the political party make those decisions, and those people can be influenced, there is not a lot of movement in those parties. Because the thing is, you're not actually creating movements once you're in office. So in a parliamentary system where groups of seats and groups of parties come together to create governments that can fracture at any time, like the great example that's going on in Israel right now, where different parties are jockeying to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu by forming coalition governments. Even if those coalition partners don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything, they work out common goals. That coalition building is done after the election. In the United States, and in similarly electorally based, in the United States and countries with similar electoral systems, there we go, that's what I wanted to say, the coalition building happens before. So who ends up on the ballot for the Democrats? Like primaries, right? Primaries are essentially our coalition building opportunities, which is why many activists believe that in areas where there's single party rule, like in large cities or in rural areas, that there is essentially the primary is much more important than the general election, because during the general election, generally, a particular party always wins. But if you can alter who represents that party before the election, then you can make real change, right? But that's very difficult for a variety of reasons. Again, this leads to the stagnation of the political parties. Essentially, the party bosses, the party elites, oftentimes know these candidates, the old guard, and are not necessarily working for them, but they're not necessarily inherently neutral either, even if they claim to be. A great example of this was Tom Perez, essentially being for Hillary Clinton in the Clinton email leaks during the 2016 primary. Right? So you get a sense that unless you can infiltrate the party, which is very difficult to do, it's very difficult to make change, because all the coalition building that sends people to the houses of government happens before the election happens, before the people are generally involved. Whereas in parliamentary systems, the voting happens first and then coalition building happens. So essentially people vote for whatever party they like best. And then they are relying on that party to fight for whatever positions that they represent in creating government of some kind, and jockeying for whatever chunk they need to in order to help form the majority, right? The point is to try and be in the majority at all times. So in a parliamentary system, you jockey with other parties to try and make that work. In the United States, that doesn't happen. All that jockeying happens behind the scenes. It doesn't happen in front of the people. So that reinforces why the politics don't move. Additionally, So there are some solutions to this. It's going to be difficult to implement them because some of them will require constitutional amendments. But one of the things you could do, which I think the For the People Act is trying to do some of, but there's also some other bills, what was used to be known as HR 4000. I don't remember what it's called now, but essentially, if you change the district magnitude in any given district to a larger number, so say instead of having one representative, you have two. And it doesn't sound like a lot more, but when there are two seats available, then more parties can compete because then the first and the second will always get a seat, right? But you want more competition in the system than the two major candidates just getting one person in, right? So a third party or a fourth party might compete because they think, hey, whether we take votes away from someone or not, it doesn't really matter. We're trying to get second place, right? The great thing about district magnitude and increasing district magnitude is that you suddenly no longer have people competing for first place. You don't need a majority. You just need some level of plurality in order to win a seat. And this allows you to campaign differently, to strategize differently, and to not have to build coalitions beforehand. You can build your coalitions afterwards because you then sent a smattering of people of different ideologies and parties to the House of Government during where they can coalesce on particular issues. You actually could keep a lot of the system the same. Obviously, there are larger issues about who has political rights and not and whatever, but you can keep a lot of our system the same. Just increasing district magnitude would help introduce new parties to the American discourse, which would, by the way, make the discourse less stagnant because there would be less reinforcement of this kind of old boys club, as it is called, even though it now includes old girls as well, I suppose. So just an interesting perspective, but I did want to talk a little bit about why it always seems like American politics aren't moving anywhere and why it seems like in other countries there are large ideological shifts. And I hope that I laid out in clear enough detail, and if not, please leave a comment. I would love to respond. I spent my undergraduate studying political science, specifically comparative politics, and this is kind of my wheelhouse. So I love this stuff, and I really actually do think that it's important for us to understand the flaws in our system, because once we understand those flaws, we can help to correct them. And once we correct those flaws, we can start to really have discussions and discourse that are more correlated to what people want. And I think that is an excellent topic worth broaching. So that's why I did this segment. I hope it has been informative to you. And obviously, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'd love to answer them. But yeah, that's why American politics are so stagnant all the time and they feel like they never move.